All right, good evening everybody, and welcome to this, the latest in our series of critical conversations. My name's Tom Mole, I am the principal of Mildert College, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We have a topic tonight that I think should be of interest to all of us. Do we live in a democracy? Our democracy, I think it's fair to say, is not in good shape. We are experiencing very low levels of voter turnout in elections, significant democratic deficit. Scotland, for example, seems to consistently, for the last many years, get governments that it hasn't voted for. Our democracy is vulnerable to capture by money and vested interests. It's open to interference from foreign state actors, to manipulation by software firms such as Cambridge Analytica. We're witnessing a populist swerve in many countries around the world. We have a second chamber that I think it's fair to say is now completely dysfunctional, packed with political appointees. And as if to advertise the timeliness of this evening's topic, we've recently discovered that you don't need to be elected in order to be appointed Foreign Secretary. But perhaps even more worryingly than these, we have to ask whether democracy can flourish in conditions that are unfavourable. In the newsscape, the mediascape, the public discourse that we now live within, we've lost, in many respects, a functioning public sphere for the free and frank exchange of views, for the debate of matters of public interest, for the formation of arguments backed up by evidence. And all of that allows conspiracy theories to flourish. And we live now in a post-truth world in which arguments, evidence, facts are all politicized, in which it often seems to be ideology all the way down. So, do we live in a democracy? I'm joined tonight by four speakers who will address this topic from a variety of interesting different angles. Professor Sir John Curtice is quite simply a national treasure, Britain's favourite cephalogist, if you can imagine such a thing. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research, as well as President of the British Polling Council. But he will be familiar to you from his many appearances on television and in the media, particularly during broadcast coverage of general elections for the last 20 years, nearly. And
try 40, Tom.
No doubt we're going to be hearing a lot more from him in 2024, which holds much of interest for us. Also, we're joined tonight by the Honourable Darren Hughes. Darren is a former member of the New Zealand Parliament. He was first elected to that body at the age of 24 and served through 3 parliaments, including in ministerial positions as Associate Minister for Social Development and Employment and Deputy Leader of the House. He is now the CEO of the Electoral Reform Society, and it's a pleasure to have him here with us tonight. We're also joined by Dr. Brian Carey, who is an Associate Professor in the School of Government and International Affairs. He joined us here at Durham University in 2021, and he's interested in a wide range of issues in contemporary political theory and moral philosophy, with a particular focus on questions involving political feasibility and public deliberation under non-ideal circumstances. So you can see immediately why he is an ideal speaker for tonight's panel. And finally, we have Mr. David Verkmann, who is a student studying for a degree in geography here at Mildert College and is a member of the steering group for this programme of critical conversations. David was born in Budapest in Hungary and won the silver medal at the International Geography Olympiad in 2021. And I can also tell you that he speaks 4 languages, but we have asked him to confine himself to English this evening. So I remind you that many of you have been to these events before, but for those of you who haven't, our aim here is simply to have an open, civil conversation about our topic. We're going to lead off with short papers or short statements from our 4 panelists, and then the floor is open for discussion. It's not a debate, there's no motion, there's no vote, nobody wins. Our aim is simply that you should leave here this evening thinking about this topic in more sophisticated ways than you did when you arrived. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to, I think we'll go in order along of the panel if that's all right. So I'm going to hand over to Brian to start us off. Thank you.
Thanks. Should I just speak like this? You can all hear me okay? I don't need to use a microphone, or
just in case there's anybody with
sure.
using the TV.
Of course.
Yeah.
Is that okay? About now? No? Oh, there we go. Okay. Not used to using my phone. Okay. So, I mean, I guess it might be particularly helpful to start with me because I'm mostly going to be talking not so much about democracy, but about the question. So this is a classic annoying philosopher thing to do, right? So to say, well, what do we mean by democracy? What are the assumptions in this question, right? Do we live in a democracy? The first thing that jumps out to me is that there's at least 2 aspects to this question, okay? So there's the conceptual question or the philosophical question, what do we mean by democracy? And of course this has various different answers. If you go back as far as roughly the ancient Greeks, they had particular ideas about what democracy is, which look very different to our modern democracies. So there's that philosophical conceptual question, what do we actually mean by democracy? Why is democracy valuable, and so on? And then once we've settled on that, if we can settle on an answer to that question, then there's the empirical question. So how do we actually measure democracy given some particular idea of what democracy is? And so depending on your answer to the first question, the conceptual question, there will be different answers to the empirical question because you'll be measuring different things essentially. Another thing you might notice about the question, do we live in a democracy, is that it seems to invite a binary yes or no answer. And you might think that that's not necessarily the right way to think about it, right? So the right answer to this question might be, in some ways we live in a democracy and in other ways we don't. It might be that to some extent we live in a democracy, right? So could we improve existing democratic institutions in some ways? It might be that we live in a democracy some of the time. So Rousseau famously had this sort of scathing quote on English democracy where he said roughly the idea that was that the English people believe they live in a democracy but they don't except during parliamentary elections, and then the people is enslaved in the periods in between. So we might be doing democracy right now, and then when we finish up today and go out, then that's the end of this little mini democracy, right? So yes or no probably isn't going to cut it. The right answer is probably going to be to an extent in some way, maybe some of the time. And then the final thing I want to point out about the way the question is phrased, do we live in a democracy? It might be that some of us do and some of us don't, right? So again, go back to the easy example for this is ancient Greek democracy, right? It's usually the first example you're given if you read a textbook about the development of democratic institutions. In ancient Greece, democracy was in fact confined to a very small percentage of the population, right? It was the men who were born in the city-state, who owned property, who were able to participate in the assemblies and so on. It wasn't women, it wasn't foreigners. It wasn't the slaves, obviously. Indeed, the fact that you had slave-holding democracies might in itself be another reason to think that what we call democracy in ancient Greece looks very different to what it is today. So that's another thing we might think about is who is the we when we talk about do we live in democracy, especially if you're interested in the idea that democracy requires some kind of equal levels of participation. It seems clear that today not everybody has the same opportunity to participate in democratic deliberation and democratic institutions. So with all that out of the way, hopefully I have like maybe 1 or 2 minutes left to just make one little further point about how we might think about answering this question. It seems to me, and given my illustrious company here that one of the things we would be very interested in thinking about in answering this question has to do with the formal structures of democracy. So the institutions, how is our electoral system set up? Could it be better? Do we have transparency? What does it mean to have free and fair elections and so on? And those things are obviously really important. They involve what you might think of as the machinery of politics. And I just want to leave you with the suggestion that another crucial aspect of thinking about this is not just the formal structures of democracy, as important as they may be, but also the attitudes of the people who make up democracy itself. So if we want to contradict Rousseau and do democracy in between elections, if we think democracy is about more than just going to a polling booth once every so many years, if we think democracy is about actually having conversations with each other like we're doing here today, then one key ingredient that we need to think about is the attitudes of people in democracy to each other. So there's a strong strand in more recent democratic theory called deliberative democracy, which really asks us to think about whether we want to think of democracy as being inherently something competitive that you win or lose, or do we want to think of democracy ideally as being something more cooperative, something like we're doing tonight. In fact, the main reason I wanted to appear here was when I got the invitation, it was pitched to me exactly as has been described, as a conversation, not as a debate where you have winners or losers. And so that's the last point I will leave you on then, is that when we think through this question in all of the various different combinations that I've just spoken about, we must of course think of the institutions and the structures in that formal sense, but we also have to think about our attitudes to one another, whether we are engaged in deliberation in a way that is fundamentally about mutual respect and about cooperation, about working together to achieve common shared goals, or whether it's more like a sports game, more like something you win or you lose, more like something that we fight over. So I hope I haven't gone too much over. I'm going to leave it at that, and thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join tonight. I'm very pleased about the no voting on the motion, because the last time I was here earlier in the year, there was a vote on the motion and I was on the losing side. So I'm traumatised by that. So it's nice to be back where we're just going to chat nicely about our opinions and listen, hopefully share some ideas and experiences together. I think, obviously the question is provocative. It would be hard if we didn't have a democracy to have this meeting right now, and it will be safely returned to our homes tonight. So I suppose in some ways, of course, we do, and we have an ability in the end to make changes that we want to see. But that's not to say that it's a destination point that we've arrived at, or to say that everything's going just swell and it needs no change. I think there are some significant challenges that exist, and some of them have always been there. They just float to the top from time to time, and through a mixture of time passing and things changing a little, they then go down the importance for people wanting to see change. And so the question, one of the questions I think tonight for us is, are we going through a period now where people are looking at challenges to our democracy and how it's functioning and wanting to follow through and actually bring about change to these things, or do we just see it as part of a cycle that a long-term government becomes unpopular, it overreaches with some of its decisions, particularly around personnel and structures. A recovered opposition party comes in promising to be much more open with the public and heroic in their democratic assumptions, and then they stay a little too long, and in the meantime, nothing gets around to being done. I think if you're pessimistic, you could point to a lot of examples of that happening in the past, but I just feel that these last few years have been, there's enough unrelated things that have happened at the same time in the last few years that make me think that we are not going back to a political assessment as it used to be, or that people are prepared to be told it's all okay now, because I think people have been so let down in so many particular areas. Tom in the introduction said a lot of the things that I was going to cover, so I thought maybe I'd just mention a couple of things and then get us going into the discussion, because I do think there are quite a lot of challenges that come from within the political system, quite a lot of challenges that are coming up from citizens, and then quite a lot of external challenges. Some of those were mentioned about disinformation, about people who participate in politics through finance, not because they've got a great commitment to the flourishing debate of public policy, but because they see a particular outcome that they want, or they see a particular ideology that they want to come through. And I think we're also seeing some external factors being imported from other countries. So, yes, the disinformation and the extended dominant prominence of conspiracy theories is a concern. We've always had conspiracy theories going right back to the beginning, by the way. It's just that now the difficulty is people, rather than thinking their lonely opinions, go on Facebook and think the whole world shares them with them. And that's a new thing. We've got to grapple with that people now quietly processing some more extreme opinions now believe they're part of a movement. And of course, statistically we know that's not correct that they're part of a movement, but if their political attitude within a democracy is shaped by a belief that I'm right and I've discovered the truth and I've got to push through with this because I need to just keep talking until people agree with me, then that creates a huge difficulty for leaders and for citizens, because leaders trying with goodwill to lead debates in the community and in the society find that people just don't believe anything they say. Likewise, I think that this is a real thing for us as the public to think about. We are exhausting our leaders. We're making it really tough to govern. Now, I know that bringing up sympathy for politicians is a real room pleaser. But when you think we're losing a lot of people who don't want to stand anymore, for example, because the level of abuse and attack has become so intense. And I think that we're at the beginning of that at the moment. But as time goes on, where do we start recruiting people? I'm quite often struck on at the one time we told people don't want to follow politics in depth anymore, and concentration spans are collapsing, and yet there's been this incredible growth in long-form political podcasts of people discussing and debating ideas. It's one of the things Rory Stewart talks about with his own public service. I should say John has his own new podcast called Trendy on Tortoise that I'm a subscriber of, so he's found time to
well done, very
do
good,
that as
very
well.
good.
That's all right. I'll do anything for £5. But so these things are really happening. It's unlocking people who want to be beyond Twitter, beyond Facebook, but it's a contradictory thing. There's no point having an intellectual and thoughtful discussion about politics if there's no candidates to vote for, because we've made it so awful for them. So we need to think about these things. We need to think about changes to the structures like voter ID laws and things like this that are all about trying to alter democracy rather than to improve it. And some of the changes we've seen in things, small area things really, but the supplementary vote in mayoral elections, we're starting to make changes now to the franchise that make it harder or more difficult to have a vote cast or counted fairly, not expanding it, which has been the general direction of travel. Finally, my last 2 points would just simply be, I'm from the Electoral Reform Society, so I will mention reform of the House of Commons. We've got to get to a situation where seats match votes. One of the big changes in the last few years has been the reduction in people who only vote for one party all their life. So when people say, 92, 97, all these, back then, and John will, I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but back then you had far fewer swing voters than what there are today. People don't have the same lifetime loyalty to political parties. And I think this is a really, interesting point, that if our seats don't match votes, then we've got lots of people who, quote unquote, live in the wrong area for political representation. That is unsustainable if people don't have lifetime political affiliation to one party. And finally, the House of Lords, the great private members club on the River Thames in Westminster. You can check in, but you can never leave. And I just think over 800 people now appointed for life, far too many people who are there for their political connections. And I think that the resignation lists we've seen recently have just really shaken people's confidence in what these institutions can do, because obviously passing legislation is a good thing, but we've got to be done by people who are elected by the public and represent the public. So those will be the things I'd put into the mix for our discussion tonight, and thanks once again for the invitation.
Okay, thanks, Darren. What I want to do is to suggest that evaluating democracy is quite difficult, because democracy and the kind of democracy you create involves choices and it involves trade-offs. Let me explain. So I was delighted to see that I'm crap at philosophy, right? Okay. So I was delighted that when Brian here started off with the same question that I would start, which is, what do we mean by democracy? But I'm going to cover a different aspect of it. So one of my starting points is, what do we mean by democracy? And then my second starting point is, what do we regard as essential or conducive to the health of democracy? Okay. And in answering both these questions, I'm going to suggest that the answer is not obvious. It's a choice, and I'll infest it with a little bit of data along the way as well. Okay, so Darren ended up talking about proportional representation because, you know, anybody who's a member of the Electoral Reform Society heavily consists of the single transferable vote in multi-member constituencies. So I mean, this is just Anorak's heaven. However, what one needs to understand is that actually the debate about electoral systems isn't just a debate about fairness, or if it's a debate about fairness, it's a debate about what do you mean by fairness, okay? And in particular, what particularly underlies it are actually two very different visions of what democracy is about. So vision number one is that it's essentially about giving voters a choice between alternative governments. And then what you want ideally is a situation where whoever gets most votes ends up with a majority inside the House of Commons, and the argument in favour of that is that it's then very, very clear who is responsible when things go wrong, like maybe now, and that when things go wrong, there is another party on the opposition benches that the voters can turn to instead and turn out the guys and lasses who have messed things up. And that in particular, therefore, this focuses on the idea of democracy as a form of accountability. You're focused on the idea that elections are about retrospective judgments on what's been done, and on the basis of that, you either decide to keep the lot who've been in for the last 5 years, or you replace them with another lot. The alternative vision says, no, actually, what you want out of an election is the creation of a representative assembly. And that you want a microcosm of the distribution of political preferences in society. But you are willing to rely on the assembly to decide who's going to form the executive and who's going to form the government. And then the trade-off then is, however, you're really focusing on the idea of elections as opportunities to express preferences about policies to be executed in future, rather than a judgment on what's been done in the past. Okay, and this is basically a fundamental choice. I mean, as it happens, my particular take on the whole debate about electoral reform in the UK is that is at the moment we've got a majoritarian conception, but it so happens, for reasons I'll happily go into in the discussion, the single member plurality system is no longer very effective at delivering that majoritarian outcome. See, for example, the fact that we've had a whole load of elections where actually no parties had an overall majority. Okay, it's possible to come up with alternative forms of electoral reform to the ones that Darren's organisation would argue in favour of, that are deliberately disproportional. See Italy. See Greece. I always have great fun when I tell Tory MPs, if you want a real vision of majoritarian democracy, go to Greece, and they look at you and think you must be absolutely bonkers, right? Because they don't have any conception of what goes on elsewhere. But so that's a fundamental choice, all right? Okay, and it's not one that can be decided by simply saying one is fair, because it depends on what you mean by fairness. Okay, so, having dealt with one particular aspect of what does democracy mean, and Brian referred to other important aspects, what then is essential to its health? And I think that certainly a couple of things that people talk about, and a couple of things that people talk about at the moment inside the UK with a degree of concern. One, I think Darren's already mentioned, which is the level of participation in formal elections. Let's leave aside deliberation, but the formal electoral process. Until the 2001 election, we always had turnouts of over 70%. We found it more difficult more recently to get voters to the polls. So that's one area. Another area, which again has been particularly an issue, is the question of trust. It's been partly a question of trust because of some people feeling they can't trust politicians because they tell us to do one thing in a pandemic and they end up doing another. But it's also because the pandemic was a really major test of the willingness of citizens to comply with what the state was telling the democratic, quote-unquote, state to tell them what to do. And more broadly, one of the things that's said is crucial for democracy to operate is that if you lose, like Darren here did in his Durham University vote, he accepts that he lost, okay? And that you wait until another 4 or 5, you can revisit the argument in 4 or 5 years' time when you have another election, but in the time being, you accept your loss and the other lot have the right to win, okay? And there are concerns expressed about both things, but you then discover that when you get underneath some of this, it's getting a bit more complicated. So one of the things that there was mentioned trust, and there is no doubt that particularly trust in government to do what people think is right for the country as opposed to pursuing their own interests, that has declined, and it reached a particular low during the 2019 Parliament. But I'll give you some idea. In the mid-1980s, 40% of us trusted governments on that criteria. By the time we got to 2019, it was down to about 15%. And there are lots of things that go on behind that. But then you then have to start asking yourself a question. Well, to what extent do we actually want citizens to trust governments? Because if we don't believe, like Catholics, in the infallibility of those who are set above us, then actually what a democracy also requires is a degree of skepticism and willingness to question and query what government is doing. So therefore you discover that actually that perhaps what we need, and this was written about way back in the 1950s, is a balance. You need the citizenry to be willing to question while at the same time being willing to comply with the authority of the state, at least for the time being. And that can be a difficult balance. And there are lots of arguments about whether or not citizens should or should not have the right to break the law if they think the law was wrong. And we saw that debate in lockdown. The minority of our society who were deeply critical of the lockdown regulations felt there were unacceptable trampling on civil rights. So hang on, why should we do this? All right? And they weren't all called Boris Johnson. If we begin to understand, why is turnout lower in our society? Well, one of the things that certainly was argued is why turnout was lower, partly about trust, though I don't think trust actually is terribly important. But certainly one big change is that if you go back to the 1960s, when I'm afraid I can still remember, right? 40% of us said, I'm either a very strong Conservative or a very strong Labour. We had a real strong sense of emotional attachment. And one of the things that my profession was writing about for years was all of this declined. We weren't quite sure whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, because the good thing was that perhaps therefore people were thinking about themselves rather than simply voting out of loyalty. But on the other hand, it seemed that people then, perhaps some of them were saying, well, I don't really feel any impetus to go out and vote. But then, on occasion, we discover that you can get people to go out and vote if you polarise them. Brexit polarised our society. Turnout went back up to the level that it was. And indeed, all of a sudden, we discovered that while people were still not identifying with Conservative or Labour, they were identifying as Remainers or Leavers, and a lot of people still are. All right? So here's a paradox. Right? Actually, if you want high turnout in a society, you probably got a polarised society. But then we don't like polarisation. But if we don't polarise and people have weak identities, we then complain about the fact they don't go out and vote. So again, there are difficult trade-offs here. And again, it's a question not nearly necessarily of wanting to maximise one or the other, but trying to identify what is the sweet spot that gets at least a decent number of people to the polls, and perhaps thinking a little bit about for themselves, but without necessarily polarising society. But achieving that sweet spot is not necessarily very easy. So do we live in a democracy? Well, first of all, define what you mean. And secondly, realise getting a democracy to function ain't easy.
Thank you.
So, since I'm from Hungary, I will talk about the Hungarian political system and then compare that to the UK. And as like a kind of presupposition, I will take that Hungary is less democratic than the UK. I don't think that would be particularly hard to believe for anyone. Actually, the economic minister of Hungary, like 4 years ago, said that his party's biggest concern is that the opposition is too bad, so they really don't have any competition, so they don't know, literally whatever they do, they'll still get voted in, which is not a sign of a healthy democracy. So in Hungary, a single party has ruled with a supermajority since 2010. In the 2010 election, they won 174 out of 176 districts with a vote share of 52%, which is not that large, is it? So, well, how did they do it? Well, basically, it is just like in the UK. It doesn't matter that much where people, it doesn't matter how many people vote, it matters where these people vote. And imagine if this were to happen in the UK, that a party barely got more than half the vote, and then they gained a majority, they gained 99% of the MPs in Parliament. They would gain a stronger majority than Sir Winston Churchill had during the Second World War. Obviously, this ignores a lot of differences between the two societies, but it's still really strange. And we have seen it. We have seen this in the UK, where in, for example, 2015, Labour went up in the popular vote by 1.4%, but they ended up losing 26 seats, and UKIP gained only 1 seat out of 650 with 12% of the popular vote, which is frankly absurd. So I got to thinking about like what checks and balances exist in the UK if obviously it's not the fact that it's based on like a first past the post system, because that doesn't really help. In Hungary, what happens is supposedly you need a supermajority to govern, to enact certain changes to the law, like change the constitution. However, that doesn't really exist in the UK. You don't need a supermajority to change anything, really. And obviously, hung parliaments do happen, but most of the time, there is a simple majority for one party or another. So, thinking about this, I came up with like two kind of explanations for it on why the UK doesn't really devolve like Hungary did. One was like a kind of explanation based on like a capitalistic approach, that basically capitalists really like it when the stock market goes up, and the stock market tends to go up in liberal democracies. So staying in a liberal democracy is really good. So people will just end up donating to parties that guarantee that. I didn't really like that explanation. I don't think that is a great explanation. However, what I think is a better explanation is something based on like a tradition. Whereas Hungary became a democratic country 30 years ago now, the UK has been more or less democratic for like 200. And whatever people may think, the state isn't Rishi Sunak, the state isn't the cabinet members, it's not even the MPs. The state is tons and tons of bureaucrats and state employees. And these people lived all their life in a liberal democracy. Their parents lived all their lives in a liberal democracy. And they see that this system, despite its many problems, is stable and it provides relatively good living. So they recognize the value of this. And I suppose it's kind of similar to modern day militaries in the sense that theoretically they could take control of the country. However, they don't really want to do that because they recognize that a liberal democracy provides many, many advantages that a dictatorship just couldn't, or not even a dictatorship, a hybrid regime perhaps. Well, so what I'm saying is basically currently the UK is largely democratic, but how could this all change if there aren't really any checks and balances, as I said? Well, what happened in Hungary was the ruling party in 2008 faced the global financial crisis, and before the crisis they also faced a leak by the Prime Minister, a leak of the Prime Minister's speech. He said things such as, no European country has done something as boneheaded as we have. Obviously, we lied throughout the last year and a half, 2 years. This was straight after an election, so they said that they lied to get elected. And after this, he said, let them protest in front of Parliament. He said this about the opposition. Sooner or later, they will get bored of it and go home. Well, he was right about this. The opposition did spend around a year protesting in front of Parliament. They had like a tent city set up in front of the Parliament, actually. But a new election never really happened. Because why would it? The ruling party had a majority. They didn't have to call one. However, when the new election happened, they lost very handedly. As I said, they only won 2 voting districts, which equaled to like 30% of the seats in parliament because of how Hungary's democracy works, or doesn't work. And this has led to an absolute collapse of that party, obviously. And this has led to the current crisis of the opposition, where in the last election in 2022, actually, the coalition that ran against the ruling party ranged from the pre-1990 Communist Party all the way to people that have been banned from Israel for being too far on the right. Well, not a lot of people wanted to vote for them for one reason or another. And this kind of could seem to many as similar to what's happening in Britain, where the Conservatives seem to face crisis after crisis after crisis, and they are more than likely about to face one of their biggest electoral failures next year. And only time can tell if this will lead to the same democratic backsliding as has happened in my home country. But as I've said, basically all the opportunities are present for Labour to build a hybrid regime like there is in Hungary, and one doesn't need to think that this will be very obvious. Like how the Hungarian ruling party changed the constitution wasn't like, oh, we'll take away your votes or something. It just minor changes that add up to something that is not that democratic anymore.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all 4 panellists for a really interesting range of introductions to our topic this evening. So now it's over to all of you, and the floor is open for questions. So please just stick your hand up and join the discussion. Francis.
Hi. So I was thinking our panellists raised a series of questions which we have to answer in order to be able to answer the main question. What do we define democracy as? Is a democracy healthy? But I also think a key question that we should potentially be discussing is who decides what our democracy actually looks like? Because if we think about democracy in this country, for example, who decides to call an election? The current government, unless the electoral period has elapsed, but they can change that with legislation, so they could theoretically make it longer. My constituency, Mid-Bedfordshire, has just had a by-election because someone resigned, but that wasn't because we wanted the election, even though we clearly did, because look at the result. We had the AV vote, obviously that was the public being able to decide whether or not we changed the electoral system, but we haven't had one since, and I think with the sort of rise of the Electoral Reform Society and things like that, there's more of a call for it now than there was before. And sort of all these questions about democracy, I sort of think needs to be underpinned by if the people who are supposed to participate in democracy aren't actually involved in how the democracy looks. That sort of adds another angle to what we're perhaps discussing.
Yeah, very interesting. Anybody want to come back on that?
I mean, you're right, it is an important question. And for the most part, constitutions tend to get framed by politicians, although they may seek some kind of endorsement via referendum process. Although I think probably what is now true here is that there is pretty much, I mean, we've developed a convention, we're good at conventions in this country. We don't have laws, but we do have conventions. We have now pretty much developed a convention whereby you're not going to significantly change the constitutional structure of the UK without a referendum. I suspect, for example, therefore, that actually probably, although their party aren't very keen on the idea, if we are going to change the House of Lords, we probably ought to have some kind of affirmative vote. So to that extent, at least, the problems that you were talking about are that, politicians will try to frame the rules to their own advantage, and they undoubtedly do. Fortunately, however, one of the most important rules of constitutional making is the law of unintended consequences. And very often politicians either misunderstand where their interests lie, or things change, and that therefore as a result it doesn't come out as they anticipate. And to that extent at least there is hope, because in the end the ability of politicians to anticipate what's going to be their advantage, it's less than perfect, and that helps to ensure that in the end they're not simply able to craft the rules as well. Of course, the other crucial thing also, which none of us talked about at all, of course, is that what is the role of your judiciary in terms of acting as police persons for our constitution? Our judiciary have become more active in that field, and obviously it played a particularly important role with respect to the prorogation of Parliament. Well, it's pretty controversial bit of judicial activism, but it did, as it were, defend what was the conventional understanding about what prorogation was about. Although, to be honest, you can have a whole debate about why did we bother about prorogation in the first place. None of the devolved institutions have it, but anyway, that's another story.
So lots of hands now. We're going to go to the back for Sophie first.
Hi, I just want to touch on what you said about polarising views and that influence on democracy and voter turnout. I think what we can observe in the last few years is that people have become very, very emotional about political issues, perhaps due to the way politicians frame it. And we see a lot of hostility being put towards minorities. And I just wonder what the consequences of that are on democracy, and if perhaps democracy becomes an option that's less ideal in dealing with options when minorities are sort of targeted by very emotional problems in society.
You guys want to pick that up?
Sure. I think that's, this is another democratic question, because minority positions need to be protected, but oftentimes that only happens if the majority agree. So you end up in some situations where you have to wait for community or topics to become popular enough for that to be protected, otherwise it can be weaponised. And as you were speaking, I was just reflecting on a very difficult referendum that's been held in Australia just recently about having an inclusion in the constitution for the indigenous people, the Aboriginal people who have been on those lands for tens of thousands of years, and there's many reflections about that. And if you have too many safeguards in your constitution to stop anything ever changing, then actually it's possible to sort of ensure nothing ever happens unless it's minor or technical, because often what can happen in a referendum campaign is that the campaign develops in a way where all the commentary and a lot of the participation is about lots of topics apart from the question written on the ballot paper by the time you come to vote. And particularly thinking about your point about minorities, what has happened, I suspect has happened in Australia is that a lot of Indigenous people have felt they were sort of marched up the top of the hill to say, yes, we're going to do this. And it was a very small change that was being proposed. It was not radical or revolutionary in any way at all. And then to see the majority vote against that sort of creates a new hurt, really. So I think you have to be very careful about how you go about change in a way that can be inclusive and not expose people to even more difficulties from the ones that you're trying to protect people from in the first situation. And I think there's always an element of people who will polarize like that for the fear of the unknown, but also who will act in a way where they know that there's a group of people who will never say it out loud, but they can tap into what they're thinking. And I think bringing forward some of those things so there's more consensus about changes, where if it goes south, that's more hurtful for the minority position, I think is something that needs a lot of thought as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of the crucial things we need to understand, I think, here is that, what liberal democracy tries to do is to resolve conflict over resources, culture, symbols, etc., without the use of armed force. And we can see examples elsewhere in the world where that doesn't work. Once you take that, and the truth is it's always going to be easier for a democracy to do that if the issues at stake are less than existential. Okay, and one of the problems with the Israeli-Hamas conflict is it's existential, viewed both sides. But we do have a very remarkable example, relatively recent example within the UK, whereby we did put a deeply polarising existential issue to an electorate. It got an 85% turnout. It didn't, in the end, fully resolve the issue. The debate is still going on. But it did resolve one of the issues that it tends to be most likely to result in armed conflict, which is an argument about who should have control over an area of territory. And that's the independence referendum in Scotland. All right? We can deeply polarised society. It engaged it. We had 85% turnout. Right? It was a brilliant exercise in participation thanks to the polarisation. But in this instance, we did resolve, at least for the time being, the kind of question that in many parts of the world results in armed conflict. And we've seen it in Northern Ireland in that respect. So we can regret polarisation, but the real question is, at the end of the day, how effective is a democracy able to resolve it and to provide an answer? And if democracy can cope with that, difficult as though it can be, then we shouldn't necessarily decry the fact that we've given the public that existential question to try and address.
Some more questions. Okay, so one from Bakey to start with.
With the appointment of an unelected member of the society into the UK cabinet, there's been lots of comments whether that is undemocratic or democratic within our system. And then I look at other democracies in the world, such as America, where it's quite common for unelected representatives to be appointed to cabinet with a certain set of skills. And often I wonder, is there a play-off between being more democratic in a sense that it must come from the assembly and then to cabinet like the British system, and then effectiveness like the US system, where we have experts making decisions about their specific areas. So I guess the two questions in terms of, do you think it's undemocratic that Lord Cameron has been made Foreign Secretary? And then secondary, do you think there's a play-off between effectivity and democracy?
Yeah, go on. On you go, Brian.
Sure. I guess the first question I would want to ask is how many people knew that was even a thing that could happen, right? So sometimes...
Of course it can.
Yeah. So sometimes the problem seems to be not necessarily... So people will say, well, the rules were followed, you voted for people knowing that this could be a system. Sometimes you just don't know they can do the things that they can do. And sometimes the problem is potentially one of transparency. I think this partly goes back as well to something that John brought up when he talked about these different models, one emphasizing accountability and one emphasizing a representational assembly. And one of the things that occurred to me through a lot of this discussion is it's all really complicated, and that complexity in itself might, in a way, undermine democracy, because there's so many things that happen, so many different ways we can talk about democracy, such complicated systems. Does the average person have these things in their mind when they're voting? Did the average person know that these things could happen even though they are within the rules? So for me, the thing I would focus on is transparency and what was the process through which Cameron was appointed. And as long as that, was within the rules, then I could see the argument, that nothing illegal was done here. This was always, there's precedent, it's happened in the past. So in that sense, yes, I think it was democratic, but in the sense that it made a lot of people go, wait, what? He's back? But then not so much. And I think both of those things could be true potentially.
Look, just in case nobody realises, there is always at least one, probably two members of the House of Lords in any UK cabinet. The leader of the House of Lords is always a member of the UK cabinet, and the leader of the House of Lords has to be in the House of Lords. Right? Okay. It's just that we have become less used to having senior positions in the UK cabinet occupied by people who are members of the House of Lords. But if you go back 20 or 30 years, it was by no means that uncommon. So to that extent, at least, we've become rather more democratic. But I mean, behind the second part of your question is another aspect of that argument about majoritarian versus representative. So as it were, arguably the apex of the majoritarian system is a presidential system. Okay, so the US has a presidential system for the executive. The executive doesn't emerge out of the legislature. And then the president simply appoints whoever he or she wants to cabinet posts subject to the assent of the Senate. Okay? The equivalent here is the system of direct elected mayors for local government. All right? That, Boris Johnson was mayor of London, but numerous other people were deputy mayors. And Andy Burnham at the moment in Manchester has various people who are deputy. I mean, nobody votes for them. Nobody knows who they are. So there's a question, therefore, also about, well, do you think the executive should be elected directly, which implies through one person, or should and therefore the executive isn't actually accountable to the legislature on a day-to-day basis. They are only accountable to the electorate, or do you think that the executive should be accountable? And that's another whole debate about which people argue and disagree. But within local government in England, at least, we have moved away from a committee system which tended to be fairly consensual and closer to the representative model to one which is much more majoritarian.
Brian. Sorry, I was calling on Brian. I'll come to you in a moment, Sarah.
I'm with Rousseau and John's first point about democracy enables you to kick out the rulers that you don't like. Mm-hmm. And actually that provides you with a way of avoiding having a dictatorship that stays forever. But in order to have that, the electorate has to have trust in the electoral system and the process itself. Yep. And my question would be, what are the fundamental requirements for that? Because if you look at certain African countries, you will see that you have major problems in the way in which elections are conducted and seen to be conducted.
It's your topic.
I think one of the things that people don't necessarily take into account on this is that there's already a lot of proportional representation used in the UK already. Many millions of people in the UK use PR elections and have done for over a quarter of a century. And with respect to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, London was mentioned. There's been new institutions that have started up that have moved away from first past the post. So I think that there is experience already, and I think draw on the New Zealand experience of deciding to move to a system of the inherited first past the post from Britain through a process that we probably wouldn't follow today because it was a little too top down, followed by an open and shut referendum process as well. So now we would use more of the deliberative techniques, I think, to have citizens' assemblies to try and understand what people are looking for in systems. And I think that's, to your point about what it would be based on. But in the end, when New Zealand had tried PR for a few elections, it actually voted in favour of it at a higher proportion to confirm it than it had at the beginning. In other words, when you give people an opportunity to use these two different styles, rather than here's the style you're used to and here's this idea and what do you think, and then it gets taken down by people who don't want any change at all. That was the experience that it did lead to the opportunity for a different style of politics. Now, by that I mean it's not just about how votes are translated into seats. That's a very important thing. It's not just about how constituency boundaries are drawn, although that's a very important thing as well. You're also trying to change political culture. How do you breed a generation of politicians who say, if I'm in a 40% party, that gives me 40% of the say, as opposed to 100% of the say, and I'll need to learn to work with people in other parties while maintaining my identity. These are things that people do in their lives and jobs and virtually every other part of society and economy, by the way, but in politics it's seen as being quite a difficult challenge. So I think, I think this would be entirely possible because the voters are changing. People are having to vote tactically at elections now. That's not a very pleasant experience to send out millions of people to vote for the person they don't really like, but they like them more than the person they hate the most. So we've got these are some of the structural changes, challenges with our current system. And then we've got this experience of using PR, STV for local elections in Scotland, for example, has worked very well, and we've got the other systems that are available too. But we think that with a multi-member preferential voting system like STV, that was invented on these isles, that would be good to put it to work and see if it changed politics.
All right, we're nearly running out of time. I'm going to take a couple more questions, firstly from Sarah.
A number of people have made the point that increasing inequality undermines democracy because you have too much power in the hands of, so to speak, the people at the top. They have money, influence, and there's corruption and so on. And we have seen all that in the last 40 years as inequality has widened. The problem is, if that's a vicious circle, which I think it is, how do you unwind it? Because nobody's going to vote, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and people at the top of the tree aren't going to vote for a reduction in inequality.
So before coming to the UK, I lived in the Netherlands, and as some of you may know, the Netherlands just had their elections this week. And in the Netherlands, it was a huge problem that farmers felt like they aren't properly being represented. They felt like it's the rich people, it's the people living in the cities that are giving us these rules about like net zero, and they're taking away our land. And what they did was they just went to the streets, they protested because there is tons of farmers in the Netherlands. It's one of the largest agricultural countries, surprisingly. And it worked. Their party got a huge share of the votes this election, and they became one of the largest parties in the Dutch government. So I think there is a power in numbers, and it has to be used.
All right, I think that is probably an excellent note to finish our discussion on this evening. I'm sure that we could go on talking about this for quite some time, and so I'm sorry to have to bring things to a close. It's an enviable task to have to close these events, but I fall back on the happy thought that it's not part of our aim here to reach a conclusion. And so it would be against the spirit of the thing for me to try and summarize. But we've heard a fascinating series of perspectives, a series of threats to our democracy that we need to take seriously, but also a sense that when we talk about threats to our democracy, what we're perhaps talking about is different visions of our democracy that come into conflict with one another. And that different institutions and different attitudes to democracy may produce different outcomes. So, before you leave tonight, I would invite you to pick up one of the feedback forms on your table. There's a QR code on the form that you can boop with your phone and tell us what you thought about this evening. Or if you prefer pen and paper, you can fill out one of the paper forms and leave it here on your table, and we'll collect them up and read them carefully, I promise. We also ask you there if there are ideas you would like to suggest for future events in this series. The next event in this series is at the beginning of February, and it's called What is Porn Doing to Us? And we will be joined on that occasion by the editor of the Journal of Porn Studies. You may not think that such a journal exists, but I promise you it does. And the editor, Professor Clarissa Smith, is coming to join us. We're also going to be joined by Miles Jackman, a lawyer who has made a career out of defending people prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. And we'll be joined as well by Pandora Blake, a sex educator and sometime porn producer. So I think that promises to be a really interesting discussion, and I hope you'll join us for that. It's at the beginning of February. Look out for more information about that coming out over email and over social media. I should say we're also going to have, as always, a student speaker at that discussion. We haven't finalised who that's going to be yet, so I can't tell you their name, but we definitely will have one. We haven't been short of volunteers for that. So please come along and join us for that next event. And I realise that some of you may have questions that you want to ask our panellists that you didn't want to ask in the general forum. And I'm sorry to say that I'm going to disappoint you, because having started this event later than usual, I now need to whisk the panellists away and feed them dinner, which is their only reward for, apart from the wonderful opportunity to talk to all of you, is their reward for this evening. So please excuse us if I steal the panellists away from you. But if you do have questions that you were desperate to ask and weren't able to ask in the in this forum, then you can put them on your feedback sheets or on your feedback online, and we promise that we will pass them on to our speakers. So thank you very much. Before we leave tonight, please join me in thanking all of our speakers.